And I'm going to introduce you to our very special guest, which I am so excited. So, our special guest was actually one of the people that you folks, many of you, suggested that we have for our special guest. Our special guest is Alex Kapitan, and Alex is a radical copy editor. That just says it all, doesn't it? And I'm going to let Alex speak about it, but this is the line that is on Alex's website that made me know that this was the perfect fit. What is radical copy editing? The concept of radical copy editing is based on the fact that language is not neutral, which is what we as a community talk about all the time. Data is not neutral. Language is also not neutral. Through language, we communicate values, we maintain norms, and we dictate what's possible. Again, we're talking about the same thing with data. Words matter. They can be used to harm or heal, to perpetuate prejudice or imagine a different world, to oppress or to liberate. And so with that paragraph alone, I'm sure you can see why Alex is a fabulous guest. And again, we're going to have a presentation from Alex. And then if you have comments during Alex's presentation, put them in the chat. And then after that, we're going to open it up for live Q&A, at which time you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. So you can see that my voice is already going, so I'm going to turn it right over to Alex. Thank you so much for being here, Alex.
Thanks so much, Heather. And thank you all for making the time for this conversation today. I'm so delighted. When Heather reached out, I was also very impressed with the work of We All Count. And I am a super data nerd myself. I don't work with data every day, but I love it. So I love all of you for all that you're doing to try to make sure that data is used in ways that perpetuate good in the world rather than perpetuate an oppressive status quo. So thanks for being here. Like Heather said, my name is Alex and I'm a radical copy editor. I'm joining you today from my home in Western Massachusetts on land that is the traditional and present day home of the Pecumtuck Nation at the intersection of the Mohawk Trail and the Quinnipiac or Connecticut River. And it's a place that people have come together for generations and centuries in peace to fish and exchange knowledge. And I really try to honor that in all that I do as well. My Radical Copy Editor project is, in short, all about helping people use words for good, based in the truth that words have power, like Heather just shared. And for me, the fact that language can hurt or heal, it can harm or create liberation, creates a responsibility to use words in ways that are conscious and with care. So that's what I try to help other people do too. Just to share a little bit more about me and my work, my Radical Copy Editor project merges a lot of different hats that I wear. I'm an editor and a word nerd. I'm an organizer and an activist. I'm an educator. I'm a faith leader, and I'm an artist. And all of these things come together and inform my approach to language. And my work is also informed by the fact that I bridge or exist outside of a number of major divides in our world. I'm not a man or a woman. I'm non-binary. I'm not gay or straight. I'm queer. I'm not a theist or an atheist. That's a fun one. And I'm not Generation X or millennial. Not that those are the only options, but I was born in the overlap between those two generations, which are often seen as being at odds. And this has always made me really deeply curious about how different people perceive and experience the world. And it also makes me a little bit of a good translator oftentimes across different divides. As a genderqueer person, I've had to quite literally speak and write myself into existence in a world that taught me that people like me don't exist. And as a white person who grew up in the deeply racist city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and is part of multiracial, multilingual, multinational, multi-able/disabled family, I'm in deep relationship with other people who embody similar sorts of multiplicity. And so the core of my work is really about solidarity across every possible line of difference. Oh, and my pronouns, I always forget, are Z and per, or just Alex. I use different pronouns in different contexts, but those are the options that would make me most happy if you were to talk about me later. I thought what I would do today is just quickly tell you about my personal approach to language and the frameworks that I use for understanding and using and teaching about language, and then share 5 specific tips that are related particularly to identity-based language, because I know that's the sort of thing that a lot of folks have thoughts and questions and feels around, and it matters a lot. And then I'll open it up so we can talk together for as much time as possible about how this comes up in your work and whatever you want to chat about. I'm very excited. Okay, so I'm going to share my slides. Yay. Hang on. Slideshow. Cool. Can you see my little 1984 typewriter? This is where being an Xennial comes in, and that I learned, I joke on my website that I learned to use tools like typewriters and card catalogs, but I never learned to loathe them, which gives me misplaced nostalgia for these sorts of things, which is fun. All right, so like we were just talking about, not only do words have the power to harm or to heal, but words also shape reality. Feminist linguist Julia Penelope once wrote that when we speak, we exercise the power of language to transform reality. Language doesn't just describe reality. Through language, we actually dictate what is real. And, you know, those of us who work with words, you know, have the power to help people describe and thus create the best possible reality we can imagine. So I want to introduce you to 3 frameworks that I use to think about and teach about and use language mindfully. And they're really the core of everything that I do. And the first one is about the super basics. So I'm an editor. So I start here with grammar, spelling, and style, right? These are the basics, the building blocks of language. And there are 3 main perspectives on the point of having language standards. The first is that it doesn't matter. We don't actually need them. If you can't understand me, that's your problem. This is obviously a harmful perspective because without language standards, no one would be able to understand each other, given that about 1.5 billion people speak English in so many different places, right? The second perspective is that language standards exist to mark people as right or wrong, educated or uneducated, upper class or lower class, people who speak English as a first language or not, etc. Right? This perspective says that there's one objectively best or most correct way to speak and write. And this is also harmful because most often what's considered best or most correct aligns with power dynamics, meaning at a certain point, what's correct actually becomes indistinguishable from elitism. The third perspective is that language standards help us communicate across lines of difference, which is a good thing. This perspective recognizes that context matters, and there's no objectively best set of standards for things like spelling, grammar, and style. If you live in certain countries, you're going to spell color with a U, right? If you live in others, you won't. If you speak Black English, or what is sometimes referred to as African American Vernacular English, you'll follow a completely distinct set of syntax rules that work perfectly in their own context. If you're a lawyer or a biologist or a slam poet, there are unique norms and even whole vocabularies that make 0 sense in other contexts, right? So we all sort of inherently know this, but there's also this sense out there that of course there's one objectively best way to use grammar, for example, but there isn't. So that's why I always start here, because approaching language standards from a place of clarity and comprehension is really different than striving to be right or better for its own sake. This is really important for folks who work with data because correctness is not actually a useful organizing principle, right? But clarity and comprehension absolutely is. So it's essential to start here with the truth that context is everything, and there's no one objectively best or most correct way to speak and write. And furthermore, that many of the rules of English are actively designed to maintain an oppressive status quo. And if I had more time, I would love to give you lots of examples, but I want to move on to my second framework, which is about the purpose of conscious language, what's sometimes referred to as sensitive language, inclusive language, bias-free language, this sort of thing. Just like with language standards, there are three main perspectives on what conscious language is all about. The first is that it's about restricting free speech and telling people what they can and can't say. This is a very popular far-right perspective that is used to discredit people who care about words. And it's based on the idea that sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me, which isn't actually true. The second perspective is that conscious language is about being politically correct, and that if you use language perfectly, you won't ever offend anyone. But that's not actually how language works, because like we just talked about, context really matters. It matters here too. The third perspective is that conscious language is about avoiding harm and violence. Because language has the power to be a tool for violence or liberation, we need to use it in ways that care for those who interact with our words. This is really important because both the first and the second frameworks, approaches rather, say that conscious language is about language policing, right? But at its best, conscious language is about context and care. Being correct and avoiding offense actually focuses on myself and looking out for my interests and putting the blame on someone else if they are offended by something I said or wrote. But avoiding harm focuses on care for others and taking responsibility for the impact that my words have on other people. So is our goal to avoid getting in trouble or having bad press, or is our goal to hold ourselves and our organizations to a certain standard in terms of the values that we hold and making a positive impact in the world? My invitation is, of course, to have that latter goal. Which brings me to my favorite framework. This is what it all comes down to for me, which is the idea that language is a spectrum from violent to liberatory. I should have said that this is on my website, and I also am happy to make these slides available afterwards to folks who were here. So if you're scribbling things down, don't worry, I can absolutely make this available to you later. So the idea that language is a spectrum is based in the idea that just as there's no such thing as objectively correct language, there's also no such thing as neutral language, right? Language is a vessel for culture. So whenever we use language, we are expressing cultural norms and values, whether we're aware of it or not. But because dominant culture loves binaries, there's a myth out there that language is either bad or good. It's either violent or neutral, right? And violent language is pretty easy to spot because it actively communicates hate, disgust, and intolerance. It slurs and hate speech, right? And this myth tells us that every other kind of language is neutral and purely descriptive. But that's not true, because in fact, there are these other ways that language operates to communicate oppressive norms and values: coded language, unquestioned language, and minimizing language. So just to go through these, coded language is what happens when violent language goes underground. It consciously or unconsciously communicates prejudice, disdain, or judgment, but in covert ways. It shows up a lot in politics, right? It's the dog whistle. It's phrases that on the surface look neutral, and those who might come from a different context may not understand what's actually being communicated, but those who are targeted by this language are really clear what's actually being said. The vast majority of language falls in the middle of this spectrum: unquestioned language that carries subtle and not so subtle cues about who and what is most valuable and normal. It's the way stereotypes and expectations and values just get baked into everyday speech in ways that most of us never question, like associating the word white with positive concepts and associating the word black with negative concepts. Minimizing language is well-intentioned, but unconsciously maintains oppressive norms. It's the backhanded compliment, right? Like, you're so articulate, which communicates that it's a surprise that someone with your identity would be articulate. Minimizing language also shows up in colorblind approaches that deny difference, like saying all lives matter, or talking about what's fair rather than what's equitable, or claiming that it's naming differences that causes division rather than, systems of oppression. Finally, there's liberatory language, which is the only language worth striving for, in my opinion. And liberatory language affirms all life, communicates compassion, love, and nonviolence, and imbues subjects with agency. So when I say liberation, what I mean is freedom from violence. That's what liberation means to me. The ultimate goal of liberation is to eradicate all forms of violence. And one way we can do that is through how we use words. The majority of harm that's caused through language isn't caused by actively violent language, just like the majority of harm that's caused through data use isn't caused by people who are striving to use data to cause harm, right? It's the same thing with language. It's rather caused, the majority of harm is rather caused by the accumulation of unquestioned language. Racism, sexism, ableism, classism, and other oppressions are perpetuated through everyday language that describes what's real and true over and over and over. And it results in violence and inequity. Because of the power of dominant culture, there is no perfect, objective, least offensive, neutral language that doesn't perpetuate the status quo. Language requires equity, not neutrality. Liberation, in particular, requires equity, not neutrality. It requires challenging the status quo. So practicing liberation in language means working to actively counter harmful language, harmful norms, and harmful stories. The good news is we have the power to create change every time we use words. But in order to do so, we have to actively work to be aware of coded, unquestioned, and minimizing language, avoid it, and subvert it. We have to constantly question the norms and values that are baked into language and choose to use language that reflects liberatory values. And we have to look to authors, scholars, and activists from communities targeted by oppression and follow their lead. I want to quickly, in the next part, lay some top tips, my 5 top tips for you all for practicing conscious language, particularly around identity. But I wanted to start here because everything that follows comes back to these key practices. At its best, conscious language is a fluid, flexible, holistic practice, not a checklist. So as I go through my top tips, if you are tempted to think, great, now I know the correct way to use words, remember, that's not the goal. The goal is care. And this is how we can, this slide tells us how we can center care. All right, you're like, whatever, Alex, tell me the top tips. I want the tips. Okay, cool. So the first tip is about appropriate specificity. This one is so huge, especially when we talk about data, right? It's so impactful. When people get grouped in overly broad categories, as I'm sure all of you know, it paints large groups of people with a single brush in ways that are stereotyping and invisibilize the diversity of experience within those broad categories. So for example, Africa often gets talked about as if it's a country rather than a continent that contains 54 countries. Similarly, if someone says Latino, but they're only actually talking about people from Mexico, that communicates that there's no difference between those two things. I once edited a manuscript where the author was talking about Native Americans who were protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline, but they weren't random Native Americans. It was specifically the Standing Rock Sioux who were protesting for their water rights and all of their allies. That specificity matters, right? If someone says LGBTQ, but they're only talking about sexuality, it erases trans people who are straight. If they say LGBTQ couples, I see this all the time, they're actually talking about people in same-sex relationships. That erases all of the bisexual and queer people who aren't in same-sex relationships, right? If someone's writing about Black people, but they say people of color, instead, they've just treated Black people and people of color as interchangeable terms, which renders every other community of color invisible and irrelevant. If they say people with disabilities, but they're actually only talking about wheelchair ramps, same thing, right? All of this has to do with context and what the most appropriate specificity in that context is. I don't want anyone to look at the slide and go, oh, I can't ever say any of the things that are on the left-hand side. No, all of these words are great. What matters is the context, right? All right, tip number 2. When we're working with data, this is a really big one, right? Euphemisms, because they're so unclear. We don't know who we're talking about when we use euphemisms. But the thing with euphemisms is that people tend to use them when they are uncomfortable talking openly or directly about something like death or sex, which makes sense. But since things like race and disability are deeply uncomfortable topics for so many people, particularly white people and non-disabled people, let's be honest, there are lots of euphemisms about these things. But again, not only do euphemisms introduce lack of clarity for people who don't know what the code means, they ultimately communicate that being Black or Indigenous or poor or disabled is something to talk around rather than talk about directly, which has impacts. So if you use a term like diverse, for example, be sure that you actually mean varied, differing, heterogeneous, rather than different from the norm or people of color. Similarly, disabled and disability are not bad words, and most people don't appreciate being referred to in cutesy ways like handy-capable. And euphemisms, I know, are also often used to attempt to neutralize things that aren't actually neutral, like oppression. Words like disadvantaged and at risk and underprivileged are considered polite ways of talking, but all they do is erase violence and put the emphasis on the individual rather than the systems surrounding that individual, right? So, for example, people with disabilities have been underrepresented in clinical trials. Sounds innocuous, right? But what's actually true is they've been actively excluded from health research. Trans and non-binary people have been actively invisibilized in health sciences. This matters. This is not to say that the word underrepresented can't be the right word to use in some instances if you're really talking about representation, right? But if we're actually talking about systems of oppression, we need to actually be clear about that if we're going to counter oppression itself. Other things that people try to use euphemisms about in an attempt to try to neutralize things are racism, police brutality, colonization, genocide. These are big ones. If something is racist, calling it racially charged or racially motivated just erases violence. And this is something that more and more actually mainstream style manuals are starting to recognize, with AP style recently being like, oh yeah, it's okay to call something racist. You probably should if it is, which is great. Good job, AP. We don't have to wait for them to give us the permission to do that though. So tip number 3, when we're working with data in particularly, it's really easy to start thinking of people as categories and numbers rather than as human beings, right? This is understandable in data research. You're just looking at numbers all the time and percentages, and you're putting people in boxes, and that is actually what data does. But that means that it's extra important to pay attention to dehumanizing shorthand that often crops up, like defining people based solely on a single characteristic, condition, or diagnosis. Because doing that basically takes that characteristic and makes it a stand-in for somebody's personhood. So instead of Blacks or the poor or the homeless, more humanizing options are Black people, poor communities, and people without housing. Instead of schizophrenics, addicts, and convicts, more humanizing options are people with schizophrenia, people living with addiction, and incarcerated people or people with a criminal record, right? Also, negative, stigmatizing, and pathologizing language, such as victim, suffering from, afflicted by, crippled by, struggling with, so many, there's just so many. It's completely ingrained, this sort of language is completely ingrained in everyday ways that people talk about folks with marginalized experiences, particularly folks with disabilities. And it implies that having that experience is an unavoidably terrible thing, which obviously isn't true. It's really easy to just say living with AIDS, has MS, uses a wheelchair, right? All right, number 4, that brings me to a corresponding tip of respecting self-identity language. Because when we start talking about how to avoid dehumanizing language, many people think, oh, I'll just use person-first language and that will take care of that. The person-first language rule, which I'm sure many, if not all of you have heard of, dictates that you should always put the word person first when describing people with disabilities or diagnoses. And this is a perfectly reasonable general tip to help people avoid dehumanizing language like paraplegics and the disabled, like we just talked about. And that's important. But there's nothing inherently better about people with disabilities versus disabled people. What happens is people treat the language rule as more important than respecting the language that people use for themselves. And that's unacceptable. It is not dehumanizing to say disabled people, but it is dehumanizing and patronizing to tell someone that the words that they use to describe themselves are wrong or to improve on their language. That's prioritizing correctness, not care. The truth is, identity is complex. It's super complex. And the language people use for identity is, of course, going to be complex because of that. And it shifts and changes over time and in different contexts. I so often see people rushing to use the language that feels trendy or most current without working to understand context first. And context really matters. The best way that you can respect the self-identity language of folks is to use the language that people use for themselves and follow the lead of groups and organizations that are led by the people that you're writing about. Not just the one person you saw on Twitter, but like a group or an organization that actually has a stand on helping folks interact with that group. See, there I go. Actually has a vested interest in making sure that people are treating them with respect. When such groups internally disagree, because this is the number one question I get, it's like, what if they don't agree? Of course they don't agree. Language is complex. Identity is complex. There's going to be different ways that people use different words in different contexts. It's okay to name that. We don't have to actually be like, this is the best and the only. We can actually say, actually, there's some disagreement about what the best language is, and say that out loud. Explain the choices you've made and why. That's a beautiful thing that you can do to actually create room for those nuances. And we can talk about that more. I'm sure people will have questions about all sorts of identity related stuff, and that's great. Okay, last tip. My final tip is about gender, because OMG, gender is everywhere in data, right? But if you believe that trans women, trans men, non-binary people, and intersex folks are real, and I really hope you do, then you have a responsibility to not ignore us in your work. Avoiding gender binary language is fairly easy. There are lots of ways to talk about people without defaulting to, phrases like women and men or the opposite gender. We can avoid that. It's also pretty easy to use singular they, both for individual people who go by that pronoun and also as a generic third person singular pronoun, rather than awkward constructions like he or she and his or her, which, let's be honest, have always been awkward. This is increasingly the standard, it bears noting, in the publishing world. And it is the official position of, among other bodies, the American Psychological Association and the APA style manual. So using singular they is not something people get to have a vote on anymore. It's like that ship has sailed, and that's good. If you were taught that they is plural and you're convinced that's the only correct way to use it, this is a great opportunity to practice care rather than correctness. The truth is the word they has hundreds of years of history as a generic singular pronoun, and that history is simply being reclaimed. That's what's going on. There's a lot of great resources out there on that if you're like, but I disagree. I will say that decoupling anatomy from identity is harder, but it's also really important. Contrary to popular beliefs, anatomy is not actually inherently female or male. This is not something that actually works as a categorizing system in our world, because between 1 in 100 and 1 in 50 bodies differ biologically from what's considered standard for female and male human beings, which is a lot of people. Second, there are plenty of men who can get pregnant and women who need prostate exams, as just 2 examples, because trans people exist. And what this means is that words like women and men don't actually speak to universal truths about bodies or experiences. So using women as shorthand for everyone who can menstruate or get pregnant, or MSM, which stands for men who have sex with men, as a population at risk for many sexually transmitted infections, as just 2 examples, is neither accurate nor inclusive of trans people. So decoupling identity from anatomy doesn't mean stripping identity from our language entirely. It just means keeping trans, non-binary, and intersex people in mind when considering who you're actually talking about and how to refer to them. Again, context is everything. And relatedly, I'll just say that female and male as words should be used sparingly. This is a definite best practice in this area, and never as nouns. Not only when you use female and male as nouns, it not only makes us sound like lab rats, but it also introduces a lack of clarity in terms of trans and non-binary folks and whether they're being included and how. Again, female isn't a universal, uncomplicated category of people who all have the same body parts, so we can't treat it that way. Yay. Yay for gender. All right. I want to make space for conversation, so I will wrap up in just a minute. But before I do, the great Toni Morrison once said, "We die. That may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives." So before I open things up for conversation, I want to bring things full circle and remind you of the power of words and the importance, above all, of care. So remember, center care. Care more about people and the agency, dignity, and well-being of those on the margins than words or rules. In particular, be curious, flexible, and nuanced when writing about identity. Constantly question the norms and values that are baked into language and use language consciously. Remember that language is a vessel for culture, and use it, and it consciously and unconsciously perpetuates and communicates cultural norms. Get clear on what your values are and create workplace cultures in which you support each other in practicing those values. Depending on the power that you personally have in your workplace, this may be easier or harder to do, but it is a big part of this whole puzzle, right? We have to be able to create spaces where we support each other, like this space, in being able to practice our values. And finally, seek out and value the perspectives of many different leaders with oppressed or marginalized experiences in the fields in which you work. This is obviously not the same as hiring one person into your company who can be responsible for all the diversity. That's not what diversity means, and that's not what that person's job should be. And that's not what this bullet point is about, right? This is about actively valuing many different perspectives from many different folks who are leaders in the areas in which you work. All right, final slide. I just wanted to throw some of my personal favorite word nerd resources onto this slide for those of you who want to dig deeper into some of this stuff. It particularly bears noting that APA Style's new guidance on what they call bias-free language is a treasure trove for identity-related language guidance for folks who do human subjects research. It's amazing. It's my favorite resource anyway, and it's particularly relevant for you all. So regardless of whether or not you are based in the United States, it's worth a read. Also, of course, if you're not in the US, some of the stuff they say will be different in your context, but it's great. So check that out. All right, stopping share. Yay!
Alex, oh my gosh, thank you so much. I think if you look in the chat, you can see the joy that is bursting out. How much love and appreciation for the work that you do and everything that you just shared. Words are so important, and I cannot actually find the words right now to say just how meaningful that was and how grateful I am to the people who suggested that we bring you here, because it's really helped me see how inextricably linked words and data are. And pretty much so much of what you just said about, I also get asked on a daily basis, I'm doing a survey on gender, give me the list. I'm doing a survey on race, give me the list. And I'm like, I can never give you the list. And I really, really like your the way you put it of care, not correctness. Because I don't say it as nicely. Being a data person, not a word person. You've said it much better than I do.
Well, I think about it a lot, and it's clear that you all do as well. So I'm glad that was good food for thought.
Yeah, so we'll open it up now. Thank you all for continuing to do what Zoom says we cannot do, which is have a meeting with more than 100 people. That is a sane thing where everyone just doesn't unmute and talk. Thank you for doing that. Feel free now to put your questions in the chat, or if you want to ask a question, raise your hand And if you want to ask a question but you feel shy, you can just direct message me in the chat, and I'll ask your question out loud if you feel shy.
Yeah,
So how's that?
great.
All right. Yeah, we're gonna have way more questions than we can deal with. So I think we'll just start at the top. Can you give some examples of person first caring gender language? I work in HIV and STD world, and MSM is standard CDC categories. So there's a lot of acronyms in there that people who aren't in that world. So what I think that is, let me take a shot at it because I'm not an expert. So
I can
I work
translate
in,
if you'd rather.
oh, great. Then yeah, you go.
Yeah,
You
actually,
go.
my partner is a long-term AIDS survivor and does a lot of work within trans
Oh,
communities
great.
of folks who live with HIV. So this is something that we talk about a lot. It's a very good question. And this is also a really good example of, I'm sure, something that everyone here at one point or another has to struggle with, which is what happens when you're working within systems, particularly government systems, or national health systems, or
Right.
those sorts of places
Exactly.
where you're working with census categories for race and they make no
Right.
sense, and like all of this
Right.
stuff. And MSM is such a good example of that, because it is something that has caused a lot of harm in data research specifically over the years. One of the things that my partner has been involved in, he's part of the Positively Trans program, which is a program of the Trans Law Center in the United States. And they specifically, a number of years ago, set out to do data collection on trans people living with HIV, because this is a population that is categorically excluded from almost anything
Mm,
on data and ever. And what happens is trans women
uh,
usually get lumped into the MSM category, which is so problematic on so many levels, right? Because on the one hand, it communicates that they're not actually women, right? On the
does
other hand,
MSM
MSM,
stands
sorry,
for?
stands for men who have sex with men.
Oh,
I
okay.
said I would
Okay.
translate, and then I forgot to translate because I got so
It's okay.
excited about the question. And of
I
course, the
understand.
CDC is the Centers for Disease Control in the United States. So those who aren't familiar with that acronym either,
Right.
I'm assuming we all
Right.
know what HIV stands for. But
Yeah.
yes, MSM means men who have sex with men, and it is a
Oh,
category that has been used in order to avoid terms like gay, right? Because not all men who have sex with men are gay. So they're
uh-huh.
talking about behavior rather than identity, which is useful.
Hmm.
But then if you lump trans women into that category, not only are you communicating that they're not women, which is violent, but you're
Right.
also skewing the data, because trans women are so disproportionately impacted by
Right.
HIV that when you
Right.
group them with this other totally different population, it makes it seem like that other population has higher numbers of HIV than they actually do,
Mm.
right?
Oh
So from a
man,
data place, you're
that's
like, oh my gosh, this doesn't work at
right.
all. Meanwhile, trans men are completely invisible. And for years and years, people thought that trans men literally did not get HIV simply because they were just absent from everyone's collection of data. There was nowhere for
Hmm.
them to check a box, right?
Hmm.
So all of this is to say, if you're working in a system like that, where you're stuck with categories that don't
Hmm.
work, the number one thing that you can do is you can raise the alarm. You can, in every part of your work, say, these categories don't work. And when people say, well, that's too bad, this is what we have to work with, push back. Even if you don't create change in that moment, every time someone says, these categories don't work, how can we do this differently? It means that people have a chink in the wall of saying, nothing will ever change. We're stuck with these categories forever.
Yeah.
Like the race categories on the census, right? And
Yep.
yes, we do have to create data that is meaningful in comparison with things that have come before, but we can do that in ways that are creative. We just have to be willing to think of creative solutions. So thing number one is push back. Thing number two is visualize, visualize, visualize. Let's say you're in a situation where you don't actually have control over who is creating the survey, but you're working with what comes out of that survey. And you're
Yeah.
like, what do I do with this? You can actually create an asterisk, or even in running text, be like, this data set is limited in these ways. And here's the impacts of those limits. Here's what happens when these categories get lumped together or this imprecise language gets used. For me, that's the number one thing that I think that I often will recommend people do, because again, that's a way of saying, oh, this isn't acceptable. We're going to need to do this differently in the future. And everyone who reads that gets that message, and instead of just blithely going along being like, yes, these categories make lots of sense. So I hope that helps. If you have a follow-up around that particular scenario you're dealing with, I'd be happy to chat more about it. But those are some general principles that I have found help to insert equity into the process.
That is so helpful. That's really, really, really helpful. Thank you so much, Alex. And I will ask a follow-up question, because we give kind of a similar advice around anytime you use social identity data of any sort. Like if you say 25% of the students in my school are Black, that sentence means nothing to me, because at minimum, I need to know what categories were given, who assigned that person that category, and who got to choose those boxes. So that's kind of our standard. It's similar to what you're saying there, because again, it makes where we need to go to make change very clear. It's this organization that is controlling all this. The pushback we get against that a lot, almost every time, is it's too long. I can't go from a sentence that has 5 words to a sentence that has 45 words. So I'm wondering, in your profession as like a word person, do you get that pushback, and how do you respond?
Absolutely, all the time. I mean, I think one of the things that is just so true is that when we are talking about this sort of landscape, we do need to use more words. And that's just something that comes up again and again and again. I think, though, that there are always creative ways that we can do that, right? So, for example, when the US trans survey was released back in 2015, they did the first ever nationally representative. Well, I guess the 2011 one was nationally representative, but this one had so many more people in it. That survey basically said at the very beginning, this is what we mean when we say trans. Here's who is included. And it was like as comprehensive a definition as I possibly could of like, if you aren't totally or fully cis, and they defined that, we really want you to take this survey, regardless of whether the word trans, means something to you. And we're going to ask you questions about that in the survey. So being able to say up front, when I use this word, or when the data uses this language, this is what it means. Here's who's included in that. Here's who's not included in that. And then it goes on to use a shortened term. That works, right? So then in the all of the tables and in all of the, right, you don't have to have like 8-point font to try to fit, because that doesn't work either, right? But I think, that's important is when you've got anytime you've got social identity data like that, it is important to define your terms. If people say LGBT, but like I was talking about appropriate specificity, and then maybe a copy editor comes along and says, oh, LGBTQ is a more common phrase than LGBT, I'm just going to use LGBTQ instead of LGBT. But were queer people actually included in the survey? Were people actually asked whether they identify as queer, or were they forced to choose bi because that was the best possible option? You know what I mean? So those sorts of things are things that I often will help people think through in terms of the specificity and the clarity of, on both the front end of data collection and also the back end of working with the data, how can we make sure that everyone knows who we're talking about? Because ultimately that's the most important thing, right? And when you make that argument to people, I find that is very helpful. When you say to people, this is about clarity, this is about making sure that everyone knows who we're talking about, that really helps, as opposed to, why can't we just use the word, I don't know, some particular word instead of a list of words?
Exactly.
Does that help? Does that answer your question?
That answers my question a great deal. Thank you. Okay, we have many, many, many questions to choose from.
Sorry, I talk so much.
No, there's no apology needed. I can't, there's so much joy in this conversation and so many people getting so much value.
And please, I know I'm not the only expert in the room on this stuff. If you've got additional thoughts on anything, any of these questions, even the ones that we're not able to get to, please drop them in the chat so people can learn from your wisdom too.
Exactly. Okay. This might be our last one. I'm working on a campaign for congenital disorders / birth defect prevention with pregnant people or people who can get pregnant. Communities don't agree with the word, quote, birth defects. Some like it, some dislike it. And we want care when talking, but also to communicate well with those who we're reaching in our campaign. In other words, a short social media
Yeah.
campaigns are where we're struggling to be clear and show care. Thoughts when one needs to be concise and catch attention with a health goal.
That is such a good question. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
asking this. It comes up a lot, particularly when there are disagreements about the words that are best used in the most humanizing ways. I think immediately of an argument I had with a very well-intentioned trans person who was very opposed to the term conversion therapy. And there are a lot of people out there who are like, yeah, this term doesn't work. It sucks. It should be called something that's clearer and less almost euphemistic or like positive sounding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they had this whole campaign to try to change it. And then I have another friend who literally does policy work at the national and international level on conversion therapy and said, we have to use this language. It's in laws. It's
Right.
in like everywhere. If we change this language, then we will literally lose the legal advocacy progress we've been making in trying to build laws that say this is not a legal practice that you should, or an ethical practice, right? And it's also the most well recognized. So I feel that that's a certainly true for this question too, is if birth defect is more immediately understandable and more well recognized, what do you do when this is a term that has ableism inherently built into it? And I think all I can say is, when in this sort of case, sort of like what I said in my presentation, the best thing you can do is say, we don't love this language. Like, this is actually, this language is kind of crummy, and here's why. And you're not going to be able to do that in every single social media post, but in a short setting, you absolutely still can say things like what some people refer to as birth defects, right? You can start to couch the language and say what other people refer to as blah and what some people refer to as this, or we use this language recognizing that it is imperfect and crappy, right? But I think that there are ways in which we can do those things. Bathroom bills is another great example. We should never use the term bathroom bills, but people know what it means. So then you see people saying so-called bathroom bills. That's great. That's helpful. It communicates that there's something not quite right about this language, but we're going to use it because people understand it. And then we're going to problematize it later. So if you click through, you'll get more information, right? Even if you don't have room for all of that in the context in which you are immediately writing. And that's the kind of stuff that I think is really, really important, is never discounting or dismissing or ignoring feedback that says this language is violent, this language is harmful. We need to find better ways to use words and to make space for that in everything that we do when we are in those kind of super sticky, nuanced situations. Yeah, such a good question.
That was a great question and a fabulous answer. We're going to fit one more in because we're getting it repeatedly from many, many different people. And that is, what do we do when there's pushback on including more identity options because there is risk to anonymity?
Yeah, that's so good. I love it. I love it. Again, all of this depends on context, right? So this is a really key piece of context. We're often working in situations where there may be only one person with a particular combination of identities or demographics, and then that becomes not an anonymous situation. And I think there isn't like a one size approach that might work in such a situation, but there are things that we can do to make sure that data is anonymized. Trying to think of an example. Certainly, I think it doesn't, I want to say that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still maintain a certain level of detail in like collecting data, but when it comes to disseminating data, that's where I think that level of nuance can be applied. If that process is a good ethical process of making sure that the people who are doing the data collection aren't going to, you know, de-anonymize things just by virtue of whatever. So again, it depends on who's doing it, what the context is, and it also depends on like the potential impact as well. So one of the things to always weigh when it comes to things like this is we're trying to do harm reduction sometimes. That's the best thing that we can do. And sometimes we're trying to do, you know, more progressive liberatory stuff. But what is the risk of harm? How much harm is it likely to cause? If somebody is being risked, like if you're risking outing somebody in a way that they may actually be the recipient of violence because of that, that ups the stakes for making absolutely sure there's no risk of that happening. If the risk isn't on that level of possibility, then maybe you don't have to have quite as drastic of an approach to protect that data, right? So, you know, those are the sorts of things that I think about when I come into those sorts of situations, because, you know, you do still want to collect particular information, but for in this particular question, when you're talking about there may only be one non-binary person in this community, that's the kind of situation where maybe you can create a larger container that that person can be held within without them being the only one. So, you know, in that case, maybe it's all people who don't have a gender that aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth, for example, as opposed to just that one category. As annoying as that might be the best option in that case. And that could probably be true in other similar sorts of scenarios.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, again, it all it all goes back to your first principles that you brought to us today, which is context and care. Like there's no checklist for what you're going to do, and things are rapidly emerging. You know, like when we do surveys in certain parts of the world, even though we are very conscious of like gender diversity or similar things, we don't always put those options in certain parts of the world where it's illegal to check a box like that. And we never thought that the United States might be one of those places where we wouldn't put the box, but we're having to start to think about that now in terms of what is the greatest act of care in terms of making sure that we're collecting data in a way that can be used for the greatest good, while caring for the very people whose data we're collecting.
I'm really grateful to David, who reached out, who lifted up in the chat, the small numbers issue is a problem for them too, because in the government agency David works in, it requires suppression of values if there are less than 11 individuals in a category for privacy reasons. The term suppressed data says a lot. Absolutely. Yeah. Like that's really intense, right? And those are the sorts of situations where, you know, is there a way to create different category options so that there are more than 11 people in that category, whether that's maybe we don't have to divide these people up by age. Maybe we don't have to divide these people up in these other ways that then create tiny, tiny categories. Maybe there are other ways we can work with those sorts of things so that we can see everyone, perceive everyone in the data, those sorts of things. And again, there are going to be situations in which you don't have that control, but you can still say, here's who was left out of this. Here's what we had to do. Here are the choices we made and why.
Thank you so much for framing it that way, because it is true. At some point, everybody has a choice. You don't, where exactly your choice is on the continuum of generating that data or evidence might not be in setting up the categories, but somewhere you do have a choice. Yeah. So I really like you framing it that way.
Can I say one more thing?
Oh, go ahead, Alex.
I just realized that what hasn't come up yet in this conversation, probably because you all are already like, this is duh, is one of the things that I deal with all the time in people who aren't data nerds is this idea that we have to collect all the things. We have to collect gender. We have to report out on race. We have to, you know, and it's like, actually, we shouldn't be collecting data unless we have a plan to use it. Right? Unless there's a reason to collect that data. And we shouldn't report out on data unless it's relevant to what the topic is. And it's amazing how often that is ignored because people are just like, oh, we're collecting demographics. Here's all the things.
No,
And that's another thing that
absolutely.
actually is lifted up by APA Style, the most recent edition. They're like, don't do this if you don't. And so if you ever are like, I need an authoritative source to prove to so-and-so that this isn't something that we need to be doing, that's another option for you.
Well, that is exactly perfect because often we do need in our work authoritative sources to be able to point to and say, we would like to stop doing this harmful
Mhm.
practice. And so if the APA is getting in line, that's amazing. Again, it's that fine balance. We don't want to wait for them to tell us what we can and can't do. But if they're advancing, if they're moving the needle, we definitely
That's
want
right.
to so we will do that. I put out the link to Alex's website into the chat. You have only had the opportunity to see about 60 minutes of the brilliance that is Alex. There is much, much more. There's a Patreon. We encourage you to donate to the Patreon, become a member of Team Alex, which is a great team to be on. You can see already how important it is, the work that Alex is doing. And Alex, I cannot say enough how grateful I am that you were willing to spend an hour with us, and it went way too fast. We're definitely going to have to bring you back really soon. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you all for these amazing questions. I'm so lifted up by the fact that you all are all out there doing good in data. So thank you for your work.
We're doing our best.
Awesome.
And for the other Talking Data Equity folks, the next 2 weeks are off due to scheduling conflicts, and we are back on May 13th with Alyssa Rose Martin, who is going to talk to us about data equity in ecology. Why spring doesn't mean what we think it means. So that's May 13th is our next time. And have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye, everyone.